Local stories, information and events. This is KC News.
Dr. Geselbracht has a doctorate in American history from the University of California at Santa Barbara. And so without further ado, please welcome Ray Geselbracht.
Thank you, Dan. It's good to be here with you today. I want to talk to you a little bit about what Korea meant to President Harry S. Truman. Initially, in the months after Truman became president, I don't think he thought very much about Korea. It was a province of the Japanese Empire, one among many, which presented some difficulties because of the sudden and largely unexpected way in which World War II ended. The military had been planning to carry the war on into 1946. They thought that an invasion, a two-part invasion of Japan was going to be necessary to end the war. And then, of course, the atomic bombs dropped on August 6th and 9th, and then the Russians came into the war on August the 9th, and the war ended on August the 14th. So the problem was, with respect to Korea and all the other parts of the Japanese Empire, who was going to surrender to whom? Now, on the day Japan surrendered, two American colonels were sitting in their office in the Pentagon. One of them was the future Secretary of State, Dean Rusk. And their commanding officer told them that the war had ended, and now it was important to determine to whom the Koreans were going to surrender, the Japanese in Korea. And the Russians were already coming into Korea, just barely, from the north, and the Americans didn't have any troops anywhere near, but the United States was determined that it would share in the surrender responsibilities in Korea. So the question was, where's the dividing line? And those colonels had no guidance other than that question that was put to them, except that they had a map hanging on the wall of Korea, the whole peninsula, and they looked at that map and they saw that the city of Seoul almost in the middle over to the west of the peninsula, and they said, well, we want the city of Seoul, the capital city, to be in the American zone. So where are we going to put the dividing line? And they saw the 38th parallel running across the map just a little bit north of Seoul. And that's how the Korean peninsula was divided. They put that forward to their superiors, who had no objection. It was almost immediately forwarded to the Russians, who also had no objection. Surprised everyone. And Korea was divided. The occupation zones were intended to endure only a short while, but they lasted a very long time, and eventually they became two different countries, one aligned with the United States and the other aligned with the Soviet Union. Now, although Truman was absorbed in the post-war years primarily by events in Europe, probably didn't give much attention to Korea, he understood that Korea was part of the emerging Cold War. And when the Cold War began to take shape in 1947 around events primarily in Europe, the emerging containment doctrine, as it was called, the doctrine of containing the Soviet Union, was applied to Korea as well. And the 38th parallel, like other dividing lines between the Soviet-dominated areas and what was coming to be called the free world, was intended to be a firm line of defense against Soviet expansion. Now, the Truman administration, despite this, continued its policy of moving Korea towards self-government and removing American troops from Korea. In 1948, the United Nations supervised elections in Korea, intended to elect a government, but they only took place in the American zone because the Soviet Union refused to allow the United Nations supervisors into the Soviet zone. Following the elections, a parliament was convened, a constitution was drafted, a president was elected, and the Republic of Korea, or South Korea, was born. And a few months later, the Soviet Union responded by forming the DPRK, Democratic People's Republic of Korea, in the north. In June 1949, just a year before the Korean War broke out, the United States withdrew essentially all of its troops from South Korea. And the Secretary of State gave a famous speech, famous at the time, in January 1950, in which he did not include South Korea in what he called the defensive perimeter of the United States defense policy. Meanwhile, the leader of North Korea, Kim Il-sung, was meeting and sending cables to Joseph Stalin, trying to get Stalin's support for an invasion of South Korea. Stalin finally improved Kim Il-sung's plan in March of 1949. It was 3 months before the invasion. And the Soviet Union was providing a lot of heavy weaponry to the north as well. The invasion came Sunday morning, June 25th, 1950. The North Koreans, with their tanks and heavy artillery, inflicted heavy casualties on the much more lightly armed South Korean forces. Word of the invasion got to Washington on Saturday night, and the Secretary of State called Truman at his home in Independence, where Truman was visiting his family. Now, Truman flew to Washington early the next afternoon, and he met with his foreign policies that evening in the Blair House across the street from the White House. Truman understood right away that the United States had to help South Korea defeat the invasion. He believed, with considerable justification, that the Soviet Union was behind the invasion. And he believed, too, that if the invasion succeeded, the Soviet Union would make an attack somewhere else, probably in Europe. His reading of the history of the 1930s, the run-up to World War II, told him that when dictators succeeded in seizing military territory, they would seize more territory. He also believed that if the invasion were not defeated and the North Koreans were not beaten back above the 38th parallel, the United Nations would be greatly weakened and would perhaps become unable to take on the great work of peace that President Truman wanted the United Nations to take. For all these reasons, even before he met with his advisors that night in Blair House on June 25th, Truman knew that the United States would have to join the fight in Korea. American forces were rushed to Korea to fight alongside the South Korean forces and eventually the forces of 15 other countries. This United Nations Command, as it was called, stopped the North Korean thrust, and on September 15th, 1950, the UN forces counterattacked behind the North Korean lines at Incheon, which is a port city about 17 miles to the west of Seoul. Now, from this time, General Douglas MacArthur was the great genius of the Incheon invasion. From this time, General MacArthur assumed a large presence in President Truman's life for several months. Now, Truman came to office in 1945 with a strong opinion of MacArthur already in mind. In June of that year, he was meeting with some of his advisors. This is way back in 1945. And some of them started expressing some concern about MacArthur. And Truman wrote some things in his diary that night. He said what they talked about was what to do with, quote, this is from Truman's diary, what to do with Mr. Prima Donna Brass Hat 5-Star MacArthur. He's worse than the Cabots and the lodges. They at least talk with one another before they told God what to do. Mac tells God right off. It's a very great pity we have to have stuffed shirts like that in key positions. Truman then concluded in his diary that Truman was a play actor and a bunco man. Well, Truman liked to get kind of work off the heat that sometimes built up in him and confide that to his diary. But he also respected MacArthur's military ability. In 1945, in April, he named him Commander-in-Chief of U.S. Army Forces. And then 4 months later, he named him Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers, which put MacArthur in charge of the Allied occupation of Japan. And then when the Korean War started, Truman chose MacArthur to be Commander-in-Chief of the United Nations Command. Now, MacArthur did not share Truman's views with respect to U.S. policy in Asia and U.S. policy with respect to the Korean War. He believed that Truman focused too much on Europe, didn't fully understand the danger of communism in Asia and the importance of Asia in the world vis-a-vis Europe. And he thought Truman was much too reticent about using military power to defeat America's enemies in Asia. And MacArthur was not willing to keep these views to himself. He said publicly that he wanted to expand the war to China and promised to use what he called maximum counterforce to wage this new war. Part of his plan was to use the nationalist Chinese regime in Taiwan to open a second front against communism. He wanted to blockade the Chinese ports, to bomb the Chinese military installations in China. He twice defied Truman's orders by making public his strong disagreement with the policies of his commander-in-chief. Truman called MacArthur's behavior, after a lot of patience, I might say, rank insubordination. And on April 11, 1951, he fired MacArthur. Truman turned to his diary again. "Quite an explosion," he said, referring to the uproar following MacArthur's firing. "Was expected, but I had to act. Telegrams and letters of abuse by the dozens." He should have said by the thousands. We have them all at the Truman Library. In the months following MacArthur's dismissal, the Chinese offensive was finally brought to a halt. The UN forces fought back, gained some ground, and finally the battle line hardened in the vicinity of the 38th parallel, where the war had started about a year before. And on July the 10th, the peace talks began in the city of Kaesong, which was close to the 38th parallel. They later moved to a little village called Panmunjom. These peace talks dragged on for 2 years, and from the very beginning, they frustrated Truman. From the first meeting on, he later wrote in his memoirs, the communists proved that they were intending to stall and delay till they got things their own way. Now, there was a very difficult issue which was primarily responsible for the failure of these peace talks over so much time. It concerned prisoners of war. The United Nations Command proposed that all prisoners of war who wished to be returned to their home countries should be exchanged for the prisoners on the UN side who wished to go back to their home countries. Truman believed that prisoners that did not want to go back to their home should not be forced to do so. And he said in a public statement, "We will not buy an armistice by turning over human beings for slaughter or slavery." But the communists didn't agree with this. They wanted to swap all prisoners on one side for all prisoners on the other side, whether or not these prisoners wanted to go back home. Truman would never agree to this. To do so, as he later said, would have been not only inhumane and tragic, but dishonorable as well. And he knew that the vast majority of the prisoners on the communist side that were held by UN command did not want to go back to their home countries. So the months dragged by. Truman's frustration grew greater and greater, and occasionally his emotions, as always, got the better of him, and he struck hard against the communists in the one place he knew was safe, his diary. And this is what he wrote there in May 1952, referring to the communists. "If you signed an agreement, it wouldn't be worth the paper it is written on. You have no morals, no honor. Your whole program at this conference has been based on lies and propaganda." And his anger grew as he was writing this. And he wrote, "Now do you want an end to hostilities in Korea, or do you want China and Siberia to be destroyed? You may have one or the other, whichever you want. These lies of yours at this conference have gone far enough. You either accept our fair and just proposal, or you will be completely destroyed." Well, once he got this outburst out of the way, he returned to what he knew he had to do, which was to seek peace in a patient way and to prevent the Korean War from turning into general war, and to achieve a lasting peace. When Truman left office in January 1953, there was still no armistice. That didn't come until the following July. The most important reason why an armistice was finally achieved was probably that after Joseph Stalin died in March of 1953, the new Soviet leaders wanted the Korean War brought to an end. The decision to take the United States into the Korean War, Truman says in his memoirs, was the toughest I had to make as president. What we faced, he writes, was the ominous threat of a third world war. The challenge had to be met. It was met. It had to be met without plunging the world into general war. This was done. We have learned bitterly and tragically from two calamitous world wars that any other course would lead to yet another war. Today, 61 years, almost, after the fighting stopped in Korea, the armistice still holds. If neither Korea nor the world is entirely at peace, the general war, World War III, that Truman so feared, has been avoided. This, he would say to us today, if he could be with us, is his greatest legacy. Thank you.
Dr. Geselbracht, thank you so very much. As an appreciation of your visit with us today, we'd like to have you take this home with you when you go back to the office.
Well, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Local stories, information and events. This is KC News.